On behalf of Mauricio Font, the director of the Donor Center, it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to a colloquium devoted to the presence of Cuban writers and activists in New York before that parting of the waters marked by José Martí's permanent arrival to our city in 1881. I want to give a special welcome to students from Queens College and CCNY and also from LaGuardia Community College that are here with us today. It is an honor to share the stage with Professor María Hernández, a CUNY colleague and frequent participant in events at the Graduate Center, and with Professor Marissa Ambio, who is currently teaching at the Stony Brook campus of our sister system, the State University of New York. Since the details of their publication and contributions to the field were emailed in the invitations, I will not repeat them. Suffice it to say that Professor Hernández has just published an annotated edition of Cirilo Villaverde's novela máxima, Cecilia Valdés, and Professor Ambio's articles on the writings of Cuban emigres and on illustrated periodicals have appeared in well-regarded professional journals. Just to frame the presentations, I would like to recall with you some historical points. The first is related to the incursions in Cuba of Venezuela-born Narciso Lopez. They had a twofold aim: liberate the island and preserve slavery. The life of Cirilo Villaverde and of many Cuban emigres living in New York and elsewhere was marked by Lopez expeditions into the islands, events in the Guerra de los 10 Años, and later a second stage of preparation and insurrection against the Spanish dominion that culminated in 1898. In 1848, Spanish authorities arrested many Cuban revolutionaries. General Lopez managed to escape to the United States. However, Cirilo Villaverde was imprisoned. After a few months of captivity, he escaped and arrived in Florida in 1849, and later went on to New York, where he became General Lopez's secretary, and later wrote his biography. Its incomplete version was published here in New York in 1851 with the title of General Lopez, the Cuban Patriot. This was one of several political tracts completed by Villaverde in New York before publishing the much revised and final version of Cecilia Valdés, I believe, in 1882. The novel, as we know, first appeared in Havana in 1839, and it is truly emblematic of Villaverde's political and literary evolution. As for General Lopez, he tried again and landed in Cárdenas, very close to my hometown, in 1850, and there he displayed for the first time the Cuban flag, and this is why Cárdenas is called, I believe to this date, Ciudad Bandera. Lopez had an army of paid soldiers. Many came from the southern states, particularly Louisiana and Kentucky. One historian has asserted that only 5 Cubans participated in this defeated incursion. He tried again in 1851 with a bigger army. The expedition again failed. His man died by firing squad, and Lopez himself was publicly executed in Havana. His followers were sentenced to forced labor, some were later pardoned, left the island, and settled in New York, where they organized and wrote on behalf of Cuban independence. So this is basically the background on which many of these periodicals and literary production that we are going to be discussing this afternoon has taken place, obviously with a cocktail added by the ambitions of the United States and the slavery states in the South that one way or the other wanted to bring Cuba into the fore of the United States by annexation. The order of business was going to be first Ana María Hernández will speak, then Professor Ambio will continue, and then we will, as is customary here, take questions at the end. And please, I welcome you all very much, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Raquel, for the presentation, and thank you to you all for coming today. My presentation, which is using, mostly based on the, my paper is called The Junta Cubana in New York as a background to the writing of Cecilia Valdez. So I will be using talking about the members of the Junta Cubana, mostly through the drawings of Victor Patricio Landaluce. So these caricatures will be playing as I speak. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, an introduction. I'm going to repeat some of the things that Professor Chan Rodriguez has already said, and then I will be identifying the players and the situations that Landaluce's caricatures refer to. Cirilo Villaverde wrote his renowned anti-slavery novel Cecilia Valdez or Angel Hill in New York between 1877 and 1879. The novel was a reiteration of an earlier, shorter piece of Cuban costumbrismo from 1839 that gave no indication of the monumental socio-historical masterpiece he later published in New York in Spanish in 1882. Cecilia Valdez has been hailed by post-colonial critics as a tour de force that portrays the peculiar socioeconomic structure of plantation slaveholding societies and their complex social interactions. It also chronicles Villaverde's ideological shift from the annexation to the independence or separatista paradigm through his contact with the Cuban expatriates who had settled in New York since the mid-1850s. I will attempt to recreate Villaverde's political milieu through the prism of the caricatures of Victor Patricio Landaluce, the Spanish loyalist, painter, and satirist in his weekly periodicals El Moro Musa and Juan Palomo, and specifically the caricatures from 1869 and 1870, two very important years, right after the beginning of the 10-year wars, and 1970 was a very tragic year, the year in which Carlos Manuel de Céspedes' son Oscar was shot to death. Domingo Boicuria was shot to death. It was a very tragic year. Then the following year, 71, things would get even worse with the shooting of the 8 students of medicine and of Juan Clemente Cenea, who had become, curiously enough, Landaluce's friend. So these caricatures record the moment in which a very young Victor Patricio Landaluce goes to Cuba and takes the side of the Spaniards. That in 1848, the conspiracy of Nicaragua, led by the Venezuelan Narciso López, was discovered in Las Villas. He was forced to flee to the United States. Meanwhile, there were many groups of conspirators in New York, New Orleans, and several cities in Florida with well-established contacts in Cuba, especially in Camagüey and Santiago de Cuba. This movement coalesced in New York under the name Consejo Cubano, headed by Gaspar Betancourt Cisneros, José Aniceto Isnaga, and others. Taking advantage of the freedom of speech prevailing in New York at the time, the Consejo conducted a blitz of propaganda through its paper La Verdad, founded and directed by Villaverde, which circulated throughout Cuba in a clandestine way and through innumerable pamphlets, manifestos, and proclamations and brochures. End of quote. Historians variously attribute the failure of the annexionist movement in the decade of the 50s to a lack of support from the United States, which was then undergoing the profound crisis that precipitated the Civil War, as well as to the adverse campaign from Cuban expatriate José Antonio Sacco, who had famously debated Villaverde on the subject. William Lewis has pointed to the impact of free speech, the influence of the anti-slavery movement in the North, and the emancipation of slaves after the Civil War as contributing factors in Villaverde's ideological shifts. Villaverde's dealing with the Junta Cubana, which had replaced the annexationist Consejo Cubano as the main organization that agglutinated Cuban expatriates, is attested to by these caricatures, which focus mostly on his wife, Emilia Casanova. There are about 100 caricatures, and about 1/3 of them present Emilia Casanova. Curiously, Cirilo appears only in the first one, so the lady with the Cuban flags in her hair and the very notorious nose is Emilia Casanova. So she's actually, in these caricatures, you can see Villaverde as Mr. Casanova rather than Emilia as Mrs. Villaverde. Okay. Yeah. Emilia Casanova had left Cuba in 1854 and had met and married Villaverde soon afterwards. The Junta Cubana became the main point of contact between the Cuban rebels headed by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes and the expatriates that raised funds and organized expeditions to Cuba from the United States from 1868 to 1878 when the war ended. Casanova interacted with the leaders of the Junta, among them Miguel Aldama, associated with Villaverde's former patron Domingo del Monte. Manuel de Quesada, one of the two brothers-in-law of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, who from Cuba had ordered the deposition of Aldama as head of the Junta Cubana and his replacement with Manuel de Quesada. José Morales Lemus, called Morales Llenos in Landaluce's caricatures, who had been sent to the United States by Céspedes as a foreign minister to negotiate the recognition of the Cuban Republic in arms, and who was involved in a scandal for presumably trying to buy Cuba from Spain through American intermediaries under Grant's presidency. And finally, Francisco Vicente Aguilera, who had begun to conspire for Cuban independence since 1867 and had left the island after the beginning of the 10-year war. Manuel Barrero considers Landaluce as one of the creators of the political satire and the political cartoon in Cuba through his association with the periodicals published by Juan Martínez Villegas in La Charanga, Don Junípero, and El Moro Musa, all published in Havana between 1852 and 1875. However, it is during the first 2 years of the weekly satirical publication Juan Palomo, 1869 to 1870, that Landaluce focuses with increasing vitriol on the Cuban insurrection of 1868. In the first issue of Juan Palomo, named after an Andalusian bandolero from the time of the Napoleonic invasion of Spain, and thus with a very patriotero feeling, ridicules the leaders of the insurrection with increasing hardness and abysmal taste. He states that his caricatures irán diseñando la vera efigies de los más notables manihueros, pues la redacción ha conseguido sus carátulas, y así tendrán estos la inesperada honra de figurar al lado de nuestros distinguidos guerreros. No se librarán los enemigos de España, por mucho que se escondan en la espesura del monte o entre las nieblas de los Estados Unidos. The Junta Cubana de Nueva York figures prominently among the more than 100 caricatures from the first 2 years of the publication, in which Landaluce declared his intention to pelear en pro de la santa causa nacional, al lado de sus hermanos los peninsulares y los leales insulares, para concluir de cortar los pies a la hidra revolucionaria que quiere asolar el país. Just as Landaluce's denigration of Cuban ethnic groups in his costumbrista drawings from 1852 had actually helped Cuban nationalists to focus on what was intrinsically Cuban, so do these caricatures from 1869 to 1870 chronicle the increasing divisions in the Junta and provide a window into Villaverde's milieu during the years immediately preceding the writing of Cecilia Valdés. Francisco Vicente Aguilera, dubbed Ágil Era, and usually portrayed holding a bottle of two, had settled in New York in 1870 and had remained in the city until his death in 1877. The same year, Villaverde started the final drafting of Cecilia Valdés. He had been one of the patriots who had tried to delay the uprising of Yara under the influence of the annexionistas, although he later lent his full support to Céspedes. Aguilera had played a major role in the insurrection before his departure from Cuba. Once in New York, he opposed annexation, which had significantly declined in the northern United States since the 50s and the execution of Narciso López, but was still popular among the wealthy landowners in the South who caucused in New Orleans. Attempts by the United States to postpone the Grito de Yara of 1868 suggesting a delay until the putative election of General Ulysses Grant as president, which actually happened, and more favorable conditions, alienated many of the Cuban annexionistas, thrusting them towards the separatistas. William Lewis underscores how this ideological shift affected Villaverde and refers to the document addressed to Céspedes in 1869 in support of the Yar uprising and the ideology of Sarco, whom he had previously debated unsuccessfully. The caricatures by Landaluce further portray the divisions caused by recalcitrant figures such as Salvador Cisneros Betancourt, Marqués de Santa Lucía, who antagonized Céspedes and substituted him as president of the Republic at war in 1871. Céspedes, identified by several C's, a P, and a few D's, Céspedes, in the caricatures is violently assailed, at times portrayed as a bigamist because of his continued relationship with Candelaria Acosta after he had married his second wife, Ana María de Quesada y Loynaz. Ana María de Quesada, a cousin of Ignacio Gramonte Loynaz and Enrique Loynaz del Castillo, all these figures were related by marriage. Major figures in the Cuban Wars of Independence had left Cuba in 1871 and had settled in New York, where her twin children, Carlos Manuel and Gloria de los Dolores, were born. During her long residence in New York, Ana de Quesada continued her efforts for Cuban independence, even meeting with President Grover Cleveland in 1885. This was already 3 years after the publication of Cecilia, but it's important anyway, who ignored her pleas for help regarding the Cuban cause. Her two brothers, Manuel, who figures prominently in the caricatures, and Rafael de Quesada y Loynaz, had fought in Mexico against Maximilian and in favor of Juarez, and doubtlessly viewed the annexation of Texas and California and the subsequent predicament of their Hispanic population with a great deal of apprehension. The memories of Alba de Céspedes Bertini, the Italian writer who was the granddaughter of Céspedes and Ana de Quesada, reiterate the ambivalence of the United States regarding Cuban independence, which may have also affected the evolution of Villaverde's ideology. Alba's memories, based on conversations with her mother Gloria, recall that she, meaning Gloria, resided in the old Victoria Hotel on 17th Street near Fifth Avenue in New York, where many Cuban patriots gathered. Certainly, Emilia Casanova, a founder of the League of the Daughters of Cuba in New York, attended these meetings. In the New York Times obituary, an account of the funeral of Aguilera in City Hall, followed by his interment in the Marble Cemetery in downtown Manhattan. This cemetery still, you can still go visit it and remember Aguilera. In the obituary from 26 February 1877, makes reference to the numerous delegations from the different Cuban societies of this city. In conclusion, and before I comment on the caricatures, the caricatures of Landaluce and Juan Palomo, while meant to assail and denigrate the expatriate community in New York, succeed instead in presenting the major figures that supported the efforts of the Mambises from New York and who provided a backdrop to Villaverde's ideological evolution that culminated in the final version of Cecilia Valdés. So we have a very meek and pliant Cirilo Villaverde and Doña Emilia, who was famous. She was notorious for embroidering. She was constantly embroidering Cuban flags and distributing Cuban flags everywhere. So Landaluce always makes fun of her by putting 2 Cuban flags in her hair, and sometimes her little dog has a Cuban flag in the tail. It's very, and there you have, so she's saying, marcho a Cuba, Cirilo, a defender nuestra causa. Tú te encargas de concluir las banderas que dejé empezadas, Cirilo. As you can imagine. Sí, Emilia. So, not very flattering for Cirilo, but remember that Cirilo Villaverde's great fame came after the publication of Cecilia Valdés. So, okay, then we have again Emilia Casanova, and it says, parece que doña Emilia va haciendo colección de los periódicos que han contribuido a darle esa triste celebridad que está gozando en el mundo. She actually was one of the central figures of the Junta Cubana, very well known, even though historical accounts do not take into consideration that much, but at the time the caricatures show what, who the important people were. Now, again, Landaluce, just as in his first book, Los Cubanos Vistos por sí mismos from 1852, denigrates the image of Cuba. So here we have Cuba as a poor black woman in tatters, and this is Morales Lemus. Morales Lemus was the ambassador of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes here in New York, the one who had orchestrated the fake purchase of Cuba. And then we have Emilia Casanova as an alternative version of Cuba, competing with that version of it. This is a very curious one because it's called Cabildo de Ñáñigos in New York, and this is 1869. And I found it quite interesting and quite peculiar. First of all, that it was assumed that the public read this, knew what the Ñáñigos were and the Cabildo de Ñáñigos, and I personally was surprised because I thought that the awareness of Ñáñigos and Ñáñigo rights were from a later date. But it's quite hilarious. Here you have Aldama, who was the president of the Consejo Cubana, the post, by Morales Lemus, and of course Doña Emilia. Here we have Doña Emilia with her two flags going to El Panteón de los Estrellados. And in the tradition of the humorous epitaphs. So we have the epitaph to Aguilera, of course, he was consistently portrayed as a drunk, of course. Céspedes, and here is one of Agramonte, who was the cousin of Ana de Quesada, and here is Quesada. Quesada was alive at the time, so it was most of these people had not died. So was Céspedes. Céspedes didn't die until 1874. So, again, Morales, the expulsion of paradise of Morales Lemus and Doña Emilia. But again, see how prominent Doña Emilia was, that she is basically, where is Cirilo Villaverde? And all of this is mostly Doña Emilia, and here we have the dog with a Cuban flag in the tail. Again, El Mitin de las Joyas. This is followed by, it's a reference to an actual meeting that took place in the Brooklyn Academy of Music on May 30, 1870, in which the Cuban ladies and gentlemen gave their jewels for the insurrection, so there is an allusion. We have here, of course, this is Manuel de Quesada, the brother-in-law of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, Doña Emilia, and this is Bramosio, who was an assistant to Morales Lemus, and that's Miguel Aldama. Miguel Aldama, who had been deposed and replaced by Quesada, and his contribution is giving away Morales Lemus. Again, the ambition of Aldama, the horse is Aldama, Morales Lemus, and Doña Emilia. 2 minutos. Okay, so I'll just rush through them. And this is again, Jordan was one of two Americans, the other one was William Ryan. Two Americans, two Southern gentlemen who fought in the Cuban War of Independence. And we have here Quesada crying because he feels that he's being upstaged by Thomas Jordan, because the ladies of New York had given him a symbolic sword. Un minuto. We have mensaje del presidente de los Estados Unidos. Again, Morales Lemus had gone to Washington and met with the president and the government of the United States, and they said, we do not want to get involved. You know that the tactics of the United States was to have the Cubans and the Spaniards kill each other, and then they would let the conspirators kill each other, and then they made their final entrance. That was very clear, and it's very clear in the Diario Perdido of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. Again, we have, this is important also for those art critics that are here, because El Andaluce is also considered a precursor of the comics, because he has stories in several frames. And I will just rush through the end of them. Another comic, Domingo Goycuría, which also refers to New York, another expedition to New York in which he died in 1970. El Juicio de Pilato, Céspedes, and then Aguilera is Caifás, Morales Lemus is Judas, and Manuel de Quesada, the brother-in-law of Céspedes, is Barrabás.
then I think I've run out of time. Okay. Well, thank you. This is a bond raised for Cuban independence and other references to the importance of the Junta Cubana in New York. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer questions afterwards.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today and for coming to our panel about Cuban immigrant periodicals and the period of the 10 Years' War and prior to mid-century. My talk is entitled Cuban immigrant periodicals during the 10 Years' War. And I'd just like to start with something from Enrique Piñero, who in his biography of Juan Clemente Zenea offers an insider's view of New York City's Cuban immigrant community at the start of the 10 Years' War. He writes, componíanse pues las emigraciones de individuos de todos sexos y edades, así como de la más diversa posición social, desde el millonario hasta el obrero torcedor de trabajos. Eran como pedazos de la patria, completos cada uno por sí solo, cada uno en pequeña imagen perfecta de los méritos y defectos del carácter cubano, fragmentos de una sociedad por el cataclismo político desprendidos e incrustados en el suelo extranjero. Desde se contaban como Nueva York los cubanos por millares, había realmente una ciudad cubana flotando, por así decirlo, en la gran metrópoli angloamericana, que vivía conforme a las costumbres de su país, que pensaba, hablaba, trabajaba con el objeto único de favorecer la independencia de la isla y apresurar la vuelta a la patria perdida y reconstruida. Piñero's metaphor of the floating city emphasizes the social and economic diversity of New York's Cuban immigrant residents, while also alluding to their solidarity based on cultural norms and shared political aspirations. The number of Cubans residing in New York at the time of Piñero's publication in 1871 is estimated at about 1,500. To further the revolutionary cause, émigrés published approximately 30 periodical titles and related ephemera and established a half-dozen political and mutual aid societies over the course of the war. Nevertheless, publishing and organizational endeavors were limited to a close-knit and elite network, a contour that stands in contrast to Piñero's depiction of interclass solidarity. To cite but a few examples of elite visibility, Juan Ignacio de Armas, an architect by training and native of Camagüey, was editor or owner of 3 of the 5 illustrated periodicals that appeared in the city between 1869 and 1874. Rafael María Merchan, an intellectual and teacher from Bayamón, served as editor of the newspaper La Revolución and later founded his own periodical, El Diario Cubano. Further review of periodical editorship reveals not only exclusivity, but also the close physical proximity shared by newspaper directors. The concentration of editorial offices in Lower Manhattan, particularly on Nassau Street and Park Row, contributed to the formation of this very limited but prolific circuit of publishers and authors. And while this area, known as Printing House Square, was the city's hub of periodical production, Nestor Ponce de Leon's bookstore and printing press, located at 4042 Broadway, became a long-standing and exclusive establishment within the Cuban immigrant community and was recognized by other Latin American intellectuals in the city and abroad. Piñero's description of the floating city may thus reflect elite objectives for interclass consolidation and the formation of a new Cuban identity, rather than point to any specific elite working-class collaboration. And yet the working class had emerged in Cuba as political agents at mid-century and as a result of the reformist agenda and ensuing labor movement. One of the primary vehicles for creating working-class political consciousness was the practice of reading aloud in cigar factories, of which the lector was symbolic. In her study, Araceli Tinajero explores the genesis of cigar factory reader and cites the first instance of reading viva voce in Havana's Partagas factory on December 21, 1865. Although soon banned in Cuba, the tradition of the lector reemerged during the 10 Years' War in the immigrant communities of Key West and Tampa, which had developed around the city's cigar industries. Through the publication and dissemination of the periodical, the working class participated in dialogue and furthered nationalist goals like public education. This talk aims to explore how engagement with periodicals and their production shaped articulations of Cuban identity during the 10 Years' War, particularly as they relate to the elite and working class. While I focus on Cuban immigrant community of New York and their periodicals, I begin by examining Juan Clemente Zenea's Revista Habanera, published in Cuba in 1861. since its approach to interclass solidarity was unique to Havana's publishing industry and resonated with New York's Cuban immigrant community almost a decade later. In the first part of the talk, I am concerned with a term that Zenea coined in the second issue of Revista Habanera, the laborante. This identity captured Zenea's conception of elite and working class solidarity, both for its etymology and its contextualization. A Latinate moniker embodied by the worker, the laborante reflects both elite and working class. It is his contextualization of the laborante, however, that provides insights as to why the elite chose an economically subordinate figure to represent aspirations of greater political freedom. As we will see, Zenea's expression of elite and working class solidarity was firmly rooted in the publishing industry. Years after its initial appearance, the laborante came to represent the revolutionary of the 10 Years' War and was a place where Cuban identity was meted out. In the second segment, I turn my attention to New York to look at how dissension within Cuban immigrant community realigned these relationships and altered the landscape of the publishing industry. The result was the emergence of the illustrated periodical as a new platform for the discussion of Cuban national identity. I begin with Juan Clemente Zenea in Havana 7 years prior to the war's start. When he published Revista Habanera in 1861, the literacy rate in Cuba was 80% and the publishing industry in decline. The reason for the crisis, he asserts, can be gleaned from a brief analysis of the typical newspaper. With a majority of space devoted to mercantile interests, including pricing and shipment arrivals, the newspaper relegates literary content to a small area at the bottom of the page. Zenea thus views the mercantile economy and the industrialization that supports it as eclipsing literary and intellectual endeavors. Since public interest in the arts was on the wane, Zenea published Revista Habanera to rejuvenate the Cuban intellectual and literary culture, particularly among the younger generations. Zenea's characterization of patrons' indifference to the arts was met with widespread response. After the publication of its inaugural issue, Revista Habanera had acquired enough subscriptions to fund production for the first trimester. In his delight at the public support of Revista Habanera, Zenea exclaims the following in the second installment from which the laborante emerges. Quote, "En fin, hemos logrado tal acogida que nos parece oportuno expresar nuestro agradecimiento y para continuar desempeñando la misión espinosa que nos hemos impuesto, decimos en nuestro regocijo, laboremos." La misión espinosa, or the work to which Zenea refers, is the publication of Revista Habanera and the resurgence of Cuban intellectual culture. It follows then that the laborantes involved in La Misión Espinosa included Zenea and the contributors to the Revista Habanera. Yet as he so emphatically indicates in his praise for the subscribers, the magazine's success depends on more than editorial and contributor efforts. Instead, Laboremos is a pact between two parties, the print intellectual and the consumer, each of which had their own task in the proliferation of culture. I qualify the former as print intellectual to underscore the role Zenea ascribes this figure and the arena in which he operates. That is, the print laborante is a member of the elite who pursues scientific inquiry or literary creation and then publicizes their work in serials and, to a lesser extent, books. Like the print laborante, the potential consumer was also the upper class since he or she possessed the means to purchase and read publications. Zenea's laborante thus corresponded to members of the elite, though he frames the promotion of Cuban culture as patriotic and therefore ostensibly relevant to a broader Cuban population. Indeed, Zenea provides a caveat to his argument that redefines the place of Cuban culture and those who have access to it. Zenea posits that the profound effects of empiricism have precluded attempts to cultivate alternative modes, like arts, insinuating its demise. Yet he later categorizes these antithetical interests of industry and creativity as equally dispensable to society. The obsolescence of either one is moved, since society, as he tells us, is divided into two factions, sustained as such by a greater power. Zenea's interpretation of the empirical spiritual dichotomy as mutually inclusive has important implications when mapped to Cuba's social hierarchy. In the following excerpts, Zenea makes explicit his vision for Cuba's social equilibrium. He says, "El hombre que en Cuba tiene la abnegación de aprender largos y laboriosos estudios es sin duda alguna el que merece mejores aplausos y sobre todo el que se dedica a las letras. Digno sería de ser colocado entre los verdaderos mártires. Mientras el hombre junto a la máquina se olvida de su condición y se embrutece hasta el punto de convertirse en una fuerza y nada más que tiene en cuenta la mecánica. To characterize the intellectual, particularly the poet, as martyr implies their work is an act of self-sacrifice. Instead of well-deserved praise, the intellectual receives no recognition and consequently no compensation. The worker similarly suffers deprivation. The close and prolonged physical proximity to the machine dulls the worker such that his attributes increasingly mimic that of the instrument. The factory hand, as it were, becomes a mere force who forgets his spiritual condition. Consequently, he is prevented from engaging in the intellectual and creative pursuits inherent to mankind. Zenea thus establishes parity between the two figures, for they both endure the same detrimental effects of industrialization, a decline in creativity. In so doing, he not only fosters solidarity between the intellectual and the worker, but also suggests that each is capable of engaging the literary. Despite their analogous circumstance and attributes, the worker and the intellectual share a few socioeconomic traits that will allow this joint literary collaboration. Zenea is particularly cognizant of their financial disparities and attempts to minimize them, if only through the sale of his magazine. In the narrative that accompanies the subscription rate, Zenea assures his readers that the price has been kept to a minimum to allow for dissemination of Revista Habanera among a cross-section of Cuban society. Zenea's anticipated audience thus exceeded the elite and working-class individuals who were also provided financial access to the printed publication. Consequently, Zenea's audience integrates two distinct socioeconomic groups to constitute a new identity, the laborante as consumer. Zenea's initiative to integrate the working class as consumers of print cultures was an early manifestation of the reformist agenda to bring together both groups through periodical dissemination. In contrast to the practice of reading aloud, which flourished in the mid-1860s, Zenea's articulation of the consumer laborante a few years earlier emphasized economic agency and purchasing power rather than literacy. As such, the laborante as print consumer may serve as a preamble to reading viva voce and the development of working class political consciousness. Despite these curtailing production costs and eliciting greater readership, Zenea was unable to sustain the publication of Revista Habanera. His description of the changes reveals further insight to the economic conditions of the print community. The revised Revista Habanera was 1/3 of its original size and was printed on paper of lesser quality in order to maintain the publication's length. His metaphor for the publication's new layout as un traje humilde not only draws attention to the insolvent state of publishing, but also creates parity between the print laborante and the working class, as both confront financial hardship. The notion of interclass solidarity based on economic hardship seems a hard sell, given that the print intellectual is still Cuba's highest echelon. And yet Zenea's characterization could speak to the elite continuum, which was broad enough to create disparity among this ostensibly singular group. Many peninsulares were bankers, merchants, tobacco manufacturers with access to colonial governing institutions. As such, regulations favored their interests. Criollos, although lacking in political influence, were also able to amass wealth through Cuba's most lucrative export, sugar. Cuba's professional elite, although made up of peninsulares and criollos, garnered a modest income as lawyers, doctors, teachers, and vocational practitioners. And while many elites engaged in intellectual endeavors, they did so gratis. As such, individuals who were exclusively dedicated to publishing or literary pursuits, like Zenea, struggled to make a living. Zenea's portrayal of the publishing industry as producing periodicals vestidas de traje humilde and speaks to the extremes within Cuba's economy, where non-commercial interests like publishing pale in comparison to market-based transactions, and creates corresponding disparities within Cuba's upper class. His allusion to the humble publisher presents a myopic view of the elite, which, while valid, also attempts to promote solidarity between the two. Despite the limitations of this comparison, his articulation of the laborante did mediate some of Cuba's steadfast divisions. Several years after its publication, Zenea reflects on the reception of his Revista Habanera and notes that María Mendide, another leading reformist and poet, began using the phrases, laboremos, vamos a laborar, o empecemos nuestra tarea como buenos laborantes, to initiate the tertulias hosted at his home. The tertulia represented a shift from an exclusively literate to a hybrid form. That is, the convergence of written and oral modes of communication created interaction between Cuba's literate and non-literate populations. By the time of the war's inception in 1868, Lauremos and its derivatives have become popular references used throughout all of Cuban society, evincing the contiguity between literary and oral realms and the possibility of interclass collaboration as proposed several years earlier by Zenea in his Revista Manera. The origin of laborante as Cuban identity was disputed within the immigrant community of New York in the spring of 1870. By this time, Zenea and fellow Cuban immigrant Rafael María Merchan both claimed ownership of the term. While the dispute may have been an act of self-aggrandizement, it also suggested that the term had acquired such importance as to warrant weeks-long arguments about the attribution and posterity in the pages of La Revolución and other New York papers. Indeed, a study of the periodicals and publications from Havana, New York, and other Cuban immigrant cities like Paris revealed commonplace uses of the laborante as revolutionary identity. The meanings ascribed to laborante is one I address in another study, but for now the Zenea Merchan debate in New York exemplifies the internal dissension that characterized the Cuban immigrant community and brings us to this second segment. While some emigres viewed discrepancy as a hindrance to the cause, others cited the public disputes in the newspapers as the realization of Republican tenets and testimony of Cubans' nationhood. Whether assessed in pragmatic or ideological terms, one debate in particular yielded a significant shift in the publishing landscape of New York's Cuban immigrant community, modified elite and working class relations, and consequently influenced the articulation of Cuban national identity. In May of 1871, El Mundo Nuevo became the first illustrated periodical published in New York to appear during the 10 Years' War, and initiated a new genre which differed in content and frequency from most previous periodicals. From the start of the 10 Years' War, Cuban emigres published 2- to 4-page newspapers at weekly, semi-weekly, and daily intervals to report on recent diplomatic or military events. The content of the illustrated periodical, in contrast, is much more varied, comprehensive, and less time-sensitive. Published at monthly intervals and in volumes of 30 to 40 pages, the illustrated periodical provides materials of current interest, but not news. Take, for example, El Mundo Nuevo's subtitle, Enciclopedia Ilustrada de Ciencias, Artes, Literatura, Educación, Industria, Comercio. Clearly, this illustrated periodical proffers, as was customary for the genre, universal knowledge. Its contents included short stories and poetry of contemporary authors, travel logs, reporting of recent scientific advancements, biographies, and engravings. Yet despite the all-encompassing subject matter of El Mundo Nuevo, it avoids the one prominent topic of the Cuban émigré periodical press, la política. El Mundo Nuevo's avoidance of political issues is notable, especially considering that its editor, Enrique Piñero, served as director of La Revolución. Piñero's resignation from La Revolución and subsequent role as editor of El Mundo Nuevo, however, may have been an attempt to assuage growing political tension within the Cuban émigré community. According to Piñero, the arrival of General Manuel de Quesada to New York in the fall of 1870 created a schism that would characterize the Cuban émigré community for the remainder of the war. While the debate played out as a personal rivalry between Quesada and Miguel de Aldama, leader of the Junta Central, it was at its core concerned with revolutionary leadership, both in terms of structure and wartime strategy. While Quesadistas promoted military initiatives, their opponents, led by Aldama and the Junta Central, sought diplomatic measures to advance the war. The working class rallied behind General Quesada and founded their own newspaper, El Demócrata, which repeatedly challenged the authority of the Junta Central and its elite members. The Quesadista-Aldamista controversy appears to map to working class and elite perspectives, respectively, thus reinforcing these socioeconomic divisions. Yet Piñero and other members of the elite withdrew from the traditional leadership of the Junta Central to found illustrated periodicals, and thus altered the discourse on Cuban nationalism and the city's publishing landscape. 3 years later, in 1874, Juan Ignacio de Armas published the illustrated periodical El Ateneo, which, like El Mundo Nuevo, professed the exclusion of political content. This is just... Despite El Ateneo's exclusion of revolutionary content, the Illustrated magazine did indeed contribute to the articulation of Cuba's national profile, but this time in cultural rather than political terms. In reviewing the 45 pages of any one issue, the reader of El Ateneo is confronted with content of diverse temporal and geographic reference. So I'm just going to look at the issue from October 1874, and this is what appears on the front cover after we see the table of contents. So we begin with the text on the following page with a gloss of the engraving on the front cover, La Pipa del Abuelo. It is the first written entry and informs us that protagonist depicted on the obverse is in Germany based on his style of garb. La Pipa del Abuelo, the author writes, es un excelente grabado de indudable mérito artístico, but does not comment further on its technical aspects. Instead, the author provides a narrative for La Pipa del Abuelo. He projects a sequence of events to take place, particularly the protagonist's enjoyment of food and drink, and thus shifts the reader's temporal reference to one of future progression and their physical locale to Europe. Next, and on the same page, appears an installment of El Caucho, an informative article on this natural resource found throughout Central and South America. The reader is redirected to the present time in the Americas. El Caucho is followed by the poem La Lección de Piano, where place is contextual rather than geographic, a room with a piano, and time is measured through the dialogue of teacher and student along with the cadence of poetic verse. On the following page, we have El Tocador de una Romana, which introduces the reader to Los Días de Popeo y Agrippina in order to describe the customs of classical Rome. The article occupies almost the entirety of the two columns except for the remaining space at the bottom, which actually is here. This is the page. So at the bottom we have an image of El Aguador in Mexico. The illustration, bearing no relevance to the nearby text, shifts the reader's attention to another time in the Americas. As a repertorio ilustrado de arte, ciencia y literatura, El Ateneo gathers artistic works and informative texts from Europe and the Americas, creating a transnational context without focusing on anyone in particular. Reading El Ateneo as a serial, however, reveals an orientation that is otherwise undetectable. That is, what at first appears as a juxtaposition of disparate texts in a singular issue comes into focus when El Ateneo is considered as a series. It is through this consistency of format and content maintained between the issues that El Ateneo articulates a singular national profile, that of Cuba. To take one example, each issue contains at least one biography with an accompanying portrait. We'll see a few of them here. We have Ignacio Altamirano, escritor mexicano, Ricardo Palma, and poeta peruano. Armas identifies these individuals and their contributions in national terms. The article about Ignacio Cervantes, which I show here, is Ricardo Palma. And then we have Ignacio Cervantes, pianista cubano. And the upcoming expose on violinist Jose White, however, deviate from all other biographies in one aspect. Since both musicians are Cuban, their place of origin corresponds to the Spanish-American colony rather than the sovereign nation. To maintain the integrity of the biographies as a series, one might suggest a conception of nation that is culturally rather than politically informed, and which all polities can claim. The inclusion of musicians Cervantes and White is an assertion of Cuban nationality based on cultural autonomy rather than the political state. By publishing illustrated periodicals, Enrique Piñero and Juan Ignacio de Armas shifted the periodical production of New York City and the conception of Cuba's national identity. In both cases, Piñero and Armas withdrew to a certain extent from the traditional elite and the production of newspapers to cultivate a different facet of the Cuban national profile. At the same time, Juan Ignacio de Armas, architect and publisher, joined the political organization La Sociedad de Artesanos Cubanos and formed an alliance with the working class in the struggle for Cuba's national independence, giving credence to Piñero's Ciudad Flotando and the Laborante, symbolic of revolutionary Cuban identity. Thank you.